rate for the first quarter, which rose slightly to a new record high of 32.6% from 32.5% in the fourth quarter of last year. And this, of course, means that the number of unemployed people now stands at 7,242,000. And according to the expanded definition of unemployment, which includes over 200,000 South Africans who have now stopped seeking work, 43.2% of the labor force was without work in the first quarter of 2021. Now, the sectors that have seen major job losses include the construction sector, losing about 87,000 jobs, trade, where 84,000 jobs were shed, and there are others as well that we'll get into with our guest, who's going to give us a clearer picture of what these numbers actually mean for us and for the economy. We're joined now by Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, who is a development economist from the University of Stellenbosch's Business School. Doctor, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us here on Morning Live.
Very good morning, Sakina, and very good morning to South Africans.
So if we look at it, the number of unemployed persons remained almost unchanged at 7.2 million compared to the fourth quarter of 2020. But what is your analysis on the unemployment statistics released yesterday? And do you believe that South Africa has reached its lowest point, or is there worse to come?
I think the reality is that the numbers are showing a very dire situation. I think it's very clear that the biggest pandemic we are facing that is unrelenting, persistent, and continuing in the last decade is both unemployment and gender-based violence. On the unemployment side, we're seeing that 11.4 million people are unemployed. I think this speaks to the 3.1 million discouraged work seekers, which sometimes are lost in the discussion. And I think that the discouraged work seekers are actually increasing by almost 234,000, up by 8%. This speaks to a total number of increase in those who are not employed by 1.4 million. We are bleeding jobs. And I think the question to ask ourselves is, who is unemployed? I think a lot of the time we look at the aggregate numbers, and I think we've got to look at the dire problem in the youth. Those under the age of 24, between 15 and 24, as measured with Stats SA, we've got a 63% youth unemployment rate. And this is seriously concerning because it speaks to social cohesion. It speaks to our young people at the peak of their lives, not being able to contribute to South Africa's economic outcomes and participate in economic activity. We also see a fundamental problem where female unemployment is higher than male unemployment, with the expanded definition at 46%, male is at 39%. This is still a crisis, irrespective of gender. But what we're seeing is that there is a gender dimension. Black Africans, the highest unemployment, followed by colored South Africans at 48% and 33.5%. This means, Sakina, that we are literally, to put it, in serious crisis levels. Countries similar to South Africa are seeing unemployment during COVID of simply around 3%, 4%, 11% at worst, particularly emerging market economies. We are sitting with an unemployment of youth at 63%, and we continue to speak about numbers as though they were simply that. But these are human lives. These are communities where the bulk of our people are unable to even buy food, are unable to meet their basic needs, are unable to contribute to the participation in any subsector. And I think this speaks to a serious crisis, and I think we must deal with it as such.
Indeed it is, because, as you said, not to lose track of the people who have stopped seeking work actively in this country, because that in itself points to a particular problem. But looking at the youth unemployment in particular, because if nothing else, surely, Dr. Moleko, this should worry us immensely. If young people in this country are not working, and by the expanded definition, it reaches a new record high of 74.7%, which means 3/4 of the youth in this country are unemployed. Surely that's not a sustainable situation.
It never was, it never will be. I think that the skills mismatch, the composition of labor demand and labor supply in South Africa continues to follow the apartheid legacy in the labor market. We continue to see wage earning differentials. We continue to see a differentiation between your formal and informal, particularly sectors, and rural and urban. And I think the issue in South Africa is that we're not accepting that the manner in which our economic policies have resulted in a lackluster employment absorption. So we are seeing a consistent low ability of South Africa's economy to absorb those who enter into the labor market. So of the more than 1 million youth that enter every year, 7% go to university, 6% go to TVET colleges. What happens to the rest? That's almost 80% of our youth who are lost in the labor market annually. We are not speaking to what happens to them. And I think we need to decisively address these and deal with the issue of this massive number of unemployed youth. I think there are things we can do. And I think, number one, let's be looking at what can be done. Number one, I think very clearly we need to look at massifying what we call conscription and giving our youth, particularly across our communities, a small grant or stipend to exit with a skill but enter into the labor market. Let's force something in the hand of the labor market to make sure that our youth can actually do something. And this must be across communities. I know we've had what we call the expanded public works program, but it hasn't sufficiently dealt with the issue and the dilemma of the youth unemployment scourge. We also have to look at least a localized community works program across every community to stimulate the participation of our youth, particularly those who are under the age of 35, participating actively in the economy. There's got to be what we call interventions that are not necessarily market-led, but rather state-led because of the severity of the crises, as we have seen with the crises of COVID. The interventions are necessary because, firstly, we are in a crisis and it cannot be left to the current market structures or the current dispensation from an economic policy perspective. Nothing changes. So every quarter we're going to keep coming here talking about the bleeding of jobs, the 11.4 million South Africans not working, but it seems that the interventions that we have put in place are not adequate to deal with the really scale of the problem.
Let me agree with you about a state-led intervention, full stop. I agree with you on that. Next point. The state doesn't have a particularly good track record, Dr. Moleko. If you look at how things like public works, job opportunities are politicized, for example, how is this going to work? Where do we even start in trying to make this a reality? I love the idea of conscription service in some way or another for the youth and a stipend for them, because whether we like it or not, there has to be an intervention. You cannot have 75%, 80% of your youth not knowing what to do with themselves.
We cannot. I think we can start at the beginning. Number one, let's accept that what we're doing is inadequate. I think unless we accept that the strategies that we've employed have led us to this point. And remember, Sakina, historically, if I look at the numbers, when we look at the subsectors that really absorb the most of our people, South Africa has a mismatch, what we call a skills bias, where the actual labor market is looking for highly skilled individuals, but the supply is low skilled or what we call semi-skilled. So that skills bias leads to a mismatch where you find even unemployed graduates. That's number one. But I think number two, we are unable to successfully ensure that the agricultural and industrial production, which is where your labor absorptive subsectors are actually driving economic growth. So we have seen a services-led type growth path in South Africa, and we really need to look at, number one, how do we invest annually sufficient investment to increase agricultural and industrial production? Why? Because we have a problem. So for us to ignore the problem and act like sufficient effect or impetus has been put in place to deal with the problem, quite clearly the numbers alone, irrespective of economic ideology, the numbers alone are telling us that government reforms have not boosted labor productivity and have not necessarily enhanced labor absorptive sectors. That's where we need to focus. The conscription, we can look at ways in which to implement this for all our youth. There is no reason why we should allow this to continue because of the disastrous effect in terms of our society. We are seeing the social effects of having almost 3/4 of your youth not necessarily economically active. This cannot be sustainable. And it is a crisis that should lead to the government coming together with a command council for the economy, necessarily putting place in, I'd say, emergency measures emergency measures because of the scale of the problem. And I think for us to ignore this and simply continue and say, no, the economic cluster is operating as per normal, they've deployed infrastructure, they've deployed institutional arrangements as per normal, the capital going towards productive sectors is inadequate to change the economic growth path. And I think that's where we need to keep speaking and keep saying that private sector investment, public sector investment, and the drive towards labor-absorptive sectors has to be focused on, has to be monitored, and if the gains are not being seen, we continue to push these annual investments and continue to have targeted support and mechanisms to increase economic activity in these sectors so that we can improve these outcomes, particularly not just trade and investment, but employment. We've got to do something very drastic.
And just finally, in speaking of monitoring interventions, last year President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, government committing about 100 billion to support and what was supposed to be create about 800,000 employment opportunities over the next 3 years. The unemployment numbers now, as we saw, marginally up, but up all the same. So is this plan actually making any sort of difference as per your assessment?
So let's start with the last number you started with. The target was 800,000 for jobs to be created. We've lost net 1.4 million. So let's just stick there. So we've lost more jobs than we've created. I think this is number one. I think secondly, the investment we've seen the last Q4 output and sustained output over the different subsectors. We've also not seen increased impetus in terms of output increase and stimulating sufficiently both your household or business demand or investment into productive sectors. So it does look like more needs to be done. Quite clearly that what is being directed in terms of flow of investment is simply inadequate. And I think one of the things that we've been saying is, how do we stimulate further then, having seen the investment drives that have been on the card for South Africa, not simply yielding results, the investment-led growth path simply not yielding results. Again here, the question is, how do you localize and create a use of local domestic surpluses to actually flow into these subsectors? We've got to start looking inwards. We've got to start looking at local solutions, domestic capital, and how do we make sure that we redirect those towards sectors that are going to improve our output. And I think this is the question. We have not seen those yielding results, unfortunately. I think the negative 7.2 decline in the annual returns or in the annual economic output speaks to that as well. And so for us to simply ignore that some of the purported outcomes are not seeing positive outcomes, and even from the fiscal perspective, we're not seeing South Africa's fiscus really balancing as such. So we need to look at ways to bolster household income, bolster economic activity, and look at how we increase participation of our people. Whatever we're doing is not working. And I think that until we really accept that, we'll continue to punt what we are punting and do what we are doing. And we are seeing that the turn and the yield is not changing. And I want to repeat that the biggest pandemic that is really upon us continuously, that is unrelenting, persistent, and really dangerous, is the issue of unemployment together with gender-based violence. And I think on the unemployment side, something seriously different has to be done.
We have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time and your input this morning. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, developmental economist at the Stellenbosch Business School, talking to us about the latest unemployment numbers that were released by Stats SA yesterday, and so many worrying stats contained in that. We have to say goodbye to